I'm not sure who scheduled me to teach the class and also to preach on the same day. Oh, wait, that was me. It sounded like a good idea 10 months ago. My voice said, no, that's not too good. But that's okay. We'll make it work. Suffering. How many people on the earth have wondered, why do we have pain and suffer on this earth? Why? We just experienced hurricanes. In fact, we have 2 survivors of the hurricanes in Tampa Bay in the audience with us this morning. Why is there cancer? I mentioned in the class I have 2 sisters suffering with cancer, fighting for their lives. Why? We have flooded homes in the Appalachian Mountains where over 100 people were drowned. Some they've not found yet, who have no electricity yet or water. Why? Why does that happen? Why are there droughts on the earth where people are hungry? Why are there wars? Why is 1 million people, mostly innocent people, at least the majority, died in the war in Ukraine, just in that war? Why is that? Why do gunmen break into schools and shoot innocent children and cause all the pain and suffering? Why is that? The world asks those questions, and at times we do. There's an assumption, is Epicurus, that lived in the 3rd century BC, that said this: if God wished to prevent evil, but cannot, then he is not all-powerful. If he can prevent evil, but will not, then he is not good. The vast majority of the world believes that. Why am I struggling? Why is people have died in my family? Why are all these things happening if there is a God? People say that. A lot of people say that. There's a major fallacy to that. They assume that no good purpose can be served by the allowance of evil and suffering in this world. But think about that. Evil according to who? Evil implies there's a standard of right and wrong, of good and evil. Could we perceive of a God, a loving God at least, that created us as nothing more than robots? Puppets on a string, where we're never tested, where we do not have freedom of choice. And that implies that we have the freedom of choice to make wrong choices. And we're going to see that the possibility of making wrong choices have adverse consequences. Peter said in 2 Peter 3 and verse 9, God is long-suffering, not wanting anyone to perish. In Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 32, God said, I have no pleasure in the death of anyone. Think about this. If good and bad choices produce the same result, what's the point? If there are no consequences, if there are no adverse consequences of making a good decision or a bad decision, then what's the difference? What are you going to learn from that? And the answer is you're not going to learn anything from that. God allows suffering in this world. He allows us to make poor choices so that we can learn to choose the good. Joshua said in Joshua 24 and verse 15, choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You could choose. Choose good, choose evil. Adam and Eve, they lived in a perfect world. And God gave them a choice. He said, you can eat anything in this garden except from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the day that you do, you will die. What did Satan say? You will not surely die. So it looked good. And Eve ate it first and gave it to Adam, and he ate it. There are consequences for disobeying God in the Garden of Eden, and we've suffered for it ever since. God said, cursed is the ground. Cursed is the ground. I'll get these in sequence here in just a minute. Don't look at that. This ground is cursed. There's going to be thorns. There's going to be weeds. There's going to be ticks. He didn't say ticks, but I hate those things. All those things are the result of sin in the Garden of Eden. Women, you're going to have extreme pain in childbirth because of sin and the poor choices of Mother Eve. And there's going to be death. There's going to be death. Spiritual death, yes. Physical death also, because of a choice that they made. And now they had to suffer the consequences, and we are still suffering the consequences of that decision. There's three reasons why there's suffering in this world. Three main reasons, let's put it that way. Number one, personal wrong choices. Peter said in 1 Peter 4 and verse 15, you will suffer if you are a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, a busybody in other people's business, etc. 40% of all car accidents in the United States, over 100,000 people a year are killed in car accidents. 40% are alcohol involved. 30% of those 100,000, they're drunk, and they kill themselves and other people. 25 million people in this country are addicted to drugs. Addicted to drugs. 10 million people are addicted to gambling. We know people, a professional, who lost his wife, lost his family, lost his home, and lost his business because of gambling. And there are many like that. 50% of all marriages end in divorce. 50%. Most, not all, most, are as a result of sexual immorality by one or both parties. 50%. Personal wrong choices have personal consequences, and they can last for generations. Wrong choices of others. Acts 10 verse 34 and Romans 2 and verse 11, paraphrased, says that God is no respecter of persons. God is no respecter of persons. Bridges fall. We saw that in Baltimore last year. where I think 18 or 20 people died when a bridge fell in Baltimore when a ship ran into it. Were those people more evil than us? They were at the wrong place at the wrong time, and they suffered because of other people's choices. It could have been faulty engineering, It could have been faulty materials. It could have been a ship driver that was drunk or on drugs. It could be all those things. Pilots crash planes. Sorry, Greg. Sometimes planes, that's rare. It is. But planes have faulty materials, and they crash. And if you're on it, you die. Did you do anything wrong to be on that plane? No. You died. You suffered consequences because of wrong choices of others. Drunk drivers, we touched on that, and accidents. Sophomore in high school, 16 years old, had a dear friend. He was in a car with other 16 and 17-year-olds, and they were doing things they shouldn't have done. And he was killed as a sophomore in high school. He never got to be 17. These things happen. And he wasn't driving, but he suffered the consequences of poor choices. In World War II alone, there were between, I've seen different numbers, but there were between 50 and 85 million people killed in World War II, the majority of which were innocent people. Innocent people died in World War II because of wrong choices of dictators. It happens. Third, wrong choices of former generations. We touched on that a little bit. Adam and Eve. Death came into the world. All these things that we suffer today started back then. In Exodus 20, the Israelites made bad choices, and God said, you're going away into captivity, all of you, because of these bad choices. We can reap the benefits of past generations, and we do. Technology, medicine. So not all of that is bad. We reap good things from the past generations, but we also reap, in fact, one writer said, and Paul in Romans 8:18 said, our sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed to us. Yes, it's painful. Yes, we suffer for all those three reasons, but it doesn't compare to what we're going to enjoy on the other side. Now, God has natural laws that he instituted from the get-go. You violate natural laws, and you can be hurt or killed. I'll read this. You can read it. But God's natural laws are this: a set of principles that describe how the world's phenomena are ordered or related. There'll be a test, by the way. They are based on evidence that can be consistently replicated and are not logically necessary. Really? Okay, we'll go with that. God set in order laws, natural laws, and I'll touch a little bit on meteorological laws, that are consistently applied in our earth, and sometimes people get hurt by those things. Newton's laws of motion. The first one, a body will not start moving until an external force acts on it. That table will not move. Your car will not move. Nothing will move unless there's an external force that acts on it. Now, the second is close to that. Objects with larger mass, I know it's not a science class, we won't be here too long, so bear with me. Objects with larger mass require more force to accelerate. It takes more force to move a big ball than it does a small ball. We all know that, but that's a law of nature. You cannot violate that. If you do, you will suffer. Number 3, the one most of us know without looking, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. We see that in rockets, has all this power, it goes down and it pushes up in the same amount as the force it went down. We understand that. Newton's laws of motion. Now you had another one right here. The law of gravity. Every object in the universe is attracted to every other object. Now we know what, that's not how we would define it, but that's how it's defined. Gravity. Let me move on to the next one, because I'm going to illustrate this here in just a second on this one. There are meteorological laws, natural laws. There are hurricanes, there are tornadoes, there are earthquakes. We have mountain ranges, we have deserts, we have varying pressure areas, we have high pressures and low pressures. And it's a constant battle between high pressure and low pressure, a cold front and a warm front. When they meet, you're going to have violent weather. And that goes up to the bottom of our troposphere, 50 to 60,000 feet roughly, something like that. When you look in Genesis 6 and 8, we didn't have that then. They didn't have that then. Those 3 chapters indicate before the great flood, the earth was warm like a greenhouse. It had not rained on the earth till Noah came, it appears. The earth was watered by a mist. We didn't have all of these cold fronts and warm fronts fighting with each other like they do today. We didn't. Therefore, they didn't have all these natural disasters, as we would call it. Had it not been for man's evil at the beginning, the flood would never have occurred. The features of the earth would not have been altered. And man would not be suffering the consequences of those decisions and those choices way back then. Gravity. Buildings may fall. They do fall. Is that God's fault? Most say it, yeah. Or a lot of people say yes. God didn't build that building. But his law of gravity will make it fall if it's shoddy materials or poor engineering. And guess what? If you're in that building, you will suffer. Remember in Luke 13, verses 4 and 5? They came to Jesus and they said, those people that were in the Tower of Siloam, were they sinners more than us? And Jesus said, do you suppose that they were worse people than you are? Things happened. That Tower of Siloam fell, and the people that were in it suffered from that. It wasn't their fault, but they still suffered because of God's natural laws, gravity. Now, think about this. This is a little bit thoughty. What if God intervened every time someone on this earth was in distress? Think about that. Why does he not intervene, people say, who don't believe in God? What if he did? Every time 20 billion people on the earth got in distress, he countermanded all of his natural laws. This earth would be a hopeless state of confusion. I had a friend last week that jumped into the Grand Canyon and he flew. I jumped into the Grand Canyon and I sunk like a rock. It's not consistent. It's not replicated. There's no order. God does things orderly. And he does not intervene in his natural laws. Now, does he use his judgment sometimes through his providence? Yes. But he does not countermand his laws, his natural laws. That does not mean there's not a God. It doesn't mean there's not a loving God. But he set these things in motion, and innocent people can die when they go against those things. Now notice this. This operating system that we operate under and have since he created it, it would argue more for atheism than it would theism. Think about it. If this was not consistent and these natural laws, one day do this and one day do that, this state of confusion that we would live in, I might be an atheist if that was the case. But it's not. All of these things point to a God who lets us make choices, sometimes poor choices, and sometimes choices that can hurt or kill us. But he does not intervene in these things. But it indicates that there is a God, and this orderly nature of this world that we live in, it's not accidental. It cannot be accidental. It cannot. Physical benefits of suffering. We touched on this a little bit in our class. What if we experience no pain? You know, it's a rare disease. I think there's about 600 in the world now. If I got this right, channelopathy, who cannot experience pain. They can touch something that's hot and they don't feel it. They can cut themselves and bleed to death and not know it. So when we think about pain, is pain a good thing or a bad thing? Yes. The answer is yes. If we did not suffer pain, how would we know to go to the doctor? I'll tell you a quick story. He's our song leader today. Veronica's parents lived in a house that was built in 1854, an old log cabin that was heated by wood stove in Kentucky. And also he was walking, but he was about 2 years old, and I was carrying him into the room where the wood stove was. He was a curious little guy. And he looked up at that, it was hot, and I said, "Don't touch." Hot, no touch. And he would reach his finger up there and no touch. And he'd look back at me and he would kind of smile a little bit. I said, "Do not touch it." Zzz. Okay, hardhead. So he had a blister on his finger. He was crying to beat the band. You know how many other times he did that? He never did it again. Pain is a good thing. We learn from pain. How do we learn not to touch a hot stove? Touch it. My mother used to say, "Go ahead, hardhead." Because I did a lot of those crazy things and suffered. You know what? Suffering helps us to be homesick. Suffering helps us to be homesick. We've had people die in our family. We have diseases. We have all these things. And we look around and you go, this world is not our home. It never was meant to be our home. If there was no pain or suffering, why do we want to leave? And the answer is we don't want to leave. There's a song, "This world is not my home. I'm just passing through." That is so true. Difficult to understand when you're 16, 17. It was for me too. It's not so hard to understand now. It's not hard to understand at all. Homesick. We're homesick. I want to read this for you. We're getting close to the end now. In Hebrews 5 and verse 8, talking about Jesus. I know it's in the middle of a context, but I'm still going to start with verse 7 a little bit, in the middle of a sentence actually. Talking about Jesus, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears, to him who was able to save him from death. We talked about this in our class this morning. And was heard because of his godly fear. Notice, verse 8. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. God learned obedience, Jesus, through the things that he suffered? Yes, he did. It said that it was such a terrible experience that God had to look away. When his son was hanging on the cross, he could not look at him. It was that bad. But he had to do it. He had to learn suffering so he can be a faithful high priest to you and me and help us with our suffering and pain. If there's no suffering, if there's no pain, how do we learn patience? The answer is we don't. Patience from what? Being good all the time? We learn patience through the things that we suffer. That's a benefit. That's a physical benefit from suffering, even though it's not pleasant at the time. Could there be bravery where there's no danger? Everyone's brave till the bullets start flying. But if there was no danger, why? There's no reason to be brave. If there's only sunshine and no rain, that's a desert. Physically and metaphorically. Spiritual benefits of suffering. We touched on it a little bit. I won't spend too much time here. My voice is about shot. Suffering and evil remind us that this world was never designed to be our eternal home. It was never designed for that. And we're so shocked when something goes wrong. Suffering is not contrary to God's goodness. Here's my Hebrews 5 and verse 8. I was a little bit ahead. Even Christ learned obedience through his suffering. It's hard for me to imagine that Christ, who created this world and everything in it and us, he and his Father determined that he needed to learn something, and he learned how to suffer to be our advocate. No one, that's why it's capitalized, when viewing the cross, can throw suffering into the face of God. God doesn't understand what suffering is, we say. Why does God not intervene while I'm suffering? Really? You're going to accuse God of that? I'm not. When we view the cross and how terrible that was, God understands suffering. Conclusion. We may not understand all of this. I don't. I've been studying it for several weeks, but I don't understand it all. Don't claim to. Did Job? Job was one of the best men on the earth, it appears, at that time. And Satan said, well, it's easy to be a servant of God. Just give him everything he wants. And God allowed him to lose everything, including his family. And finally, Job says, God, I don't understand this. And starting in Job chapters 38, 39, and 40, part of 41, God says, I'll answer you if you can answer all these series of questions. Read those sometime, starting in Job 38. Job just put his hand over his mouth and says, I can't. I'm not saying anything. God never told Job why he was suffering. Never did. We don't understand every facet of this, and we don't have to. We don't have to. But I tell you this, we can explain enough of it